everyone, welcome to Charts and Perspective, where we use charts to dive into the world of economics and financial markets. I'm Jennifer Nash, an economic and market research analyst for TMX Verify. Today, we're going to examine unemployment claims as a recession indicator. Every week, I post an update on new unemployment claims shortly after the BLS report is made available. This tends to be a rather volatile indicator, so I like to focus on the 4-week moving average to try and offset some of that volatility. Now, typically, the financial press takes a fairly basic view of the latest number, and the market may react for a few minutes or hours to that initial estimate, and then a week later, the estimate gets revised and the process repeats itself. Here's one of our charts from that update. In the latest report, initial jobless claims, those filing for unemployment for the first time in a given week, were at a seasonally adjusted level of 247,000. This is the highest level in 8 months. And that put the 4-week moving average at 235,000, the highest level in 7 months. For continuing jobless claims, the number of people who have already filed for unemployment and have continued to claim benefits for a subsequent week, the latest data showed that the 4-week moving average was just below 1.9 million, its highest level since November of 2021. Now, in both of these charts, to no surprise, we see that the 4-week moving average begins to rise at or near the start of a recession. Then we see it hit its peak at the end of a recession and begin to fall as we are coming out of one. These charts, however, give a rather distorted view of unemployment claims. Why? Because they're based on raw, albeit seasonally adjusted number that does not take into account the substantial growth in the civilian labor force since 1967. The civilian labor force is the total number of working age people, 16 and over, who are either employed or unemployed but actively seeking employment. It does not include military or institutionalized individuals, but it essentially represents the portion of the civilian population that is considered to be, quote, available for work. The civilian labor force has more than doubled over our time frame, from 76.5 million in January of 1967 to over 170 million today. So, to get a better understanding of the weekly unemployment claims data from our previous charts, let's view the numbers as a ratio of the civilian labor force. The latest ratio, rounded to 2 decimals, is at 0.14%, the highest level since October 2024. This means that out of 10,000 workers, 14 made an initial application for unemployment insurance payments. To 3 decimals, the latest ratio is at 0.135%, which is clearly well below the all-time high we saw in April of 2020 at the start of the COVID pandemic, and just above the all-time low from October 2022. But what about continued claims? Here's the ratio of continued unemployment claims to the civilian labor force. The record low for this ratio was reached a few years ago in June 2022, but has been trending upwards since, with the latest ratio at 1.11%, its highest level of the year. Meaning that out of 1,000 workers, approximately 11 are receiving continuing unemployment insurance benefits. So, what does all this information actually tell us about where we are in the business cycle and recession risk? Well, a particularly interesting feature of this unemployment claims ratio series is its past effectiveness as a leading indicator for recession starts and a virtually dead-on coincident indicator for recession ends. In both ratio charts, I've highlighted the value at the month of recession starts. In every instance, the trough in claims preceded the recession start by a few too many months, but the claims peaks were nearly identical with recession ends. Here's a table that shows the actual numbers. So back to our question. What does this all tell us about where we are in the business cycle and our current recession risk? If we look at the data in this table, we can see that the initial claims lead time for a recession has ranged from 3 to 22 months, with an average of 11 months. Currently, we're a whopping 31 months from the most recent initial claims low back in October 2022. And additionally, we see that the continuing claims lead time for a recession has ranged from 3 to 20 months, with an average of 11 months. We're currently a staggering 35 months from the most recent continued claims low from June of 2022. It feels like we've been on a recession watch for much of the past 3 years. It seemed inevitable a few years ago, but one never appeared. The fears died down towards the end of 2024, but have started to creep back in, especially with the US economy recording its first quarter of negative GDP growth since 2022. All of that to say, we are not out of the woods yet, especially when looking through the lens of less traditional recession indicators, such as this one. That's all for our discussion. Thank you for tuning in. For more economic and market insights, you can find my content regularly on the Advising Perspectives website under the AP Chart section.